welcome to the latest installment of CM News. Today, we have a wonderful panel of experts here to discuss the Battle of Yorktown, taking place in 1781. But first, we're going to go over a quick PowerPoint to give us some background and context. The Battle of Yorktown, otherwise known as, people refer to this as the time that the world was turned upside down. We'll see why quite shortly. Approaching Yorktown, acting on commands from one of the highest-ranking members of the British military, Sir Henry Clinton, General Cornwallis occupied Yorktown in order to set up a stronger naval presence in the area. Hearing of this, Washington sent 2,500 American soldiers down to Yorktown, along with 4,000 soldiers from the French army. So this kind of goes to show us the immense impact that the French had on the U.S. Revolution in this battle, particularly. And they met other troops at Yorktown down there as well. So it wasn't just the mere 6,500 fighting. Once they arrived, Americans set up fortification approximately 800 yards from the British camps and began to try and gain ground and push forward with their positioning. Now, let's talk about why the battle itself occurred. Britain had already experienced many setbacks throughout the war. They lacked resources, which was one of their main issues. Our artillery was short in a lot of battles, and this was one of the main reasons that America was winning. So George Washington and the French general Rochambeau, I think is a close pronunciation to it, met to talk about and plan the future. And they originally wanted to fight the British in New York, but they realized that it would be a difficult battle and probably costly, not only financially, but as far as the lives of their soldiers went. So they decided to attack Yorktown because it was easy for French patriots to blockade the British, especially with them setting up that naval presence in the area. They were vulnerable at the time. Now, as far as key players go in this battle, for the British, we had General Charles Cornwallis, who was the commander of British troops, and Charles O'Hara, who personally surrendered the British Army to Washington, which was obviously a pivotal part of this conflict. Then you have the Hessians, who were German mercenaries. They didn't really have a dog in this race as far as the American Revolution went. They were just fighting because they were paid to fight, and mainly they were fighting for the British. So these Hessians, some key figures with them consisted of Johann von Seewaffen and August Voigt von Salzburg, who were some of the leading commanders of those Hessians. And for the French, you have Comte de Rochambeau, who is a leader of French ground forces. Comte de Grasse, leader of French fleet. Then, obviously, the one and only Marquis de Lafayette, leader of one of the divisions of the Continental Army that helped corner the British in Yorktown. Now, it's important to note, although Lafayette was a Frenchman, he wasn't a commander of the French army like these other leaders right here. He was actually commanding American troops, which is an interesting thing about Lafayette there. As far as Americans go, you have George Washington, who is the highest-ranking general in American history at this point and was quite high-ranking in this point as well, respectively. And he was a leader of all American troops. Then you have Alexander Hamilton, who was the leader of American infantry unit. Now the battle begins. Allied French and American soldiers advanced upon the 7,200 British forces and surrounded them in Yorktown. Roughly 18,000 American and French soldiers. So these numbers are coming from the soldiers, the 6,500 that was traveling with Washington, met down there. Just surrounded Great Britain. Their main goal was to, before they really committed to a full-on attack, they wanted to make sure that the artillery was destroyed, depleted, and the British didn't have a lot of artillery, because we'd seen that was the downfall of them in many battles. Allied armies continued to pummel artillery against the British, again, just making sure that was taken care of so their final rush could be an effective rush with not much artillery to stop them. And after a few nights, a new trench was dug closer to the British fortifications, and the Allies began to move closer. And this is where the battle really gained footing, and they were able to they were able to see much success. Our first speaker needs no introduction, Mr. Ciaran Flanagan, a world-renowned expert on foreign key players in the American Revolution, particularly, in fact, the Battle of Yorktown. So super lucky to have you on the show, Mr. Flanagan. Our first question for you is going to be, what was the significance of Marquis de Lafayette's presence in the Battle of Yorktown?
Well, thank you so much for having me today. So, the significance of Lafayette's presence in the Battle of Yorktown was a great one. He played a major role in the battle. Washington chose him as one of his 3 division commanders over the Continental Army during the Yorktown campaign. And it's important to note, as you mentioned earlier, that Lafayette commanded American troops rather than French troops in the Battle of Yorktown. Lafayette and his army were involved in numerous battles which helped push Cornwallis to the Yorktown Peninsula. The first contribution Lafayette made at Yorktown was shadowing Cornwallis as he was planning to build a defensive water port at Yorktown. Lafayette was then ordered by Washington to block any attempt of escape by land by the British. Lafayette and his force of 3,000 men essentially pinned the British against the Atlantic, where a French naval fleet blocked escape by sea. As events progressed, Lafayette and Washington's armies met up for the siege of Yorktown, where they defeated Cornwallis.
Very interesting, Mr. Flanagan. Now, obviously, there was a fatal mistake made by General Cornwallis that caused the British to ultimately lose that battle. What was that fatal mistake? What was that nail in the coffin for the British?
Well, you see, Cornwallis was stationed in South Carolina originally and planned on invading North Carolina. But setbacks occurred in which Cornwallis's troops fell ill, local resistance were cutting off his supply chain, and the heat was so hard to handle. Then Cornwallis decided that Virginia was the source of the rebel supplies and it would be easier to conquer. Without waiting for permission from his superior Henry Clinton, Cornwallis and his troops marched to Virginia and set up camp on the Yorktown Peninsula. This was a fatal mistake because Yorktown could easily be blockaded by the Americans at the Chesapeake Bay. This is what the Americans did, and Cornwallis' supplies from New York were cut off.
Very interesting. Now, we talked a little bit about Hessians and the key figures within those Hessians, within that Hessian army, or a little bit earlier. Would you care to touch upon some of the contributions of those key figures?
Of course, I would love to. German mercenaries, or Hessians, played a large role on the side of the British in Yorktown. Some leading figures included Johann von Sebothon and August Voigt von Salzburg. Sebothon and Salzburg were the commanders of the Ansbach-Baruch regiment, which surrendered to the Americans while helping the British escape. Also, another leading figure, Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Fuchs. He commanded the Fusilier Regiment Erkbrins, which helped the British defend its position during the siege, which eventually failed, but it worked while it lasted, but it didn't last for long.
Very interesting, Mr. Flanagan. Well, we really appreciate your contributions on the show. It's been a very riveting discussion. We're going to pass it on to Dean Simmons, who, similar to Mr. Flanagan, is has a specialty in key figures. However, Dean's area of expertise tends to lie in some more national areas. He's an expert on American key figures. So, Dean, why don't you take it away? No introduction needed, really.
Hello, Will. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So, Dean, which of Washington's tactics, which we know he's famous for, these tactics that set him apart as a leader, as a general, that were really revolutionary, no pun intended, for the time. Which of these tactics specifically would you say was the most conducive to victory for the colonists and for America?
Yeah, so Washington's his most significant tactic was to surround Yorktown. So what he would do is originally he would make a trench that was roughly 1,000 yards around Yorktown, and then with the river he would set up men at Gloucester Point. So if British ever wanted to flee, they would be trapped. So as time went on, these trenches would get closer and closer, and I believe the closest was 600 yards from Yorktown. And so what Washington intended was, from these trenches, he would set up cannons and he would bombard Yorktown. And this actually did a lot of damage because over time, Yorktown's defense started to collapse and their walls were destroyed, and Yorktown and the British, they didn't really have time to put up back their walls. So this tactic was extremely successful, but it did take a little bit of time.
Very interesting. Now, as far as key figures go, especially in the American realm, Yorktown is quite well known for being a battle where many American key figures, when I say key figures, I mean quite key figures within the Revolution, as in people who were founding fathers, helped sign the Declaration of Independence, and just very pivotal individuals as far as the war goes. So, Dean, who would you like to touch upon some of these key figures and the contributions they made, specifically ones that we see in other points politically in the American Revolution?
Yeah, so the one major person who helped with the Federalist Papers and the Constitution was Alexander Hamilton. So he was known with the government, but he also wanted to improve his reputation by proving himself on the battlefield. And so what he helped in the war because he was in charge of 400 men and Redoubt number 10. And his job was to go on the east side of Yorktown, and he would attack these barricades that British had. And these barricades were put up by the British because it made it really hard for large groups of Americans to continue going forward. And it was Alexander Hamilton's job to stop one of these. And so he successfully did it by destroying their defense and ended up by killing all of them. And this allowed Americans to continue to become closer to Yorktown. And this was very, not well known, but very significant.
Very interesting. Now, you can't bring up Hamilton without then in turn bringing up Jefferson. However, Jefferson is not known for his involvement in this particular battle. In fact, he's known for his lack of involvement with this particular battle. Would you like to touch upon Jefferson's absence during this time? Not even just not fighting in the battle, but just not being generally present for the formalities that go along with it, being as important as he was.
Yeah, so Jefferson is mostly known for creating the Constitution. Even the British knew that, and he knew that the king knew that he was a big part of the Constitution. And Jefferson thought, if the king knows that I created this, I'm going to be a big threat in the war. And he thought it was safer for him not to go to the war, and he could save his life and also help with the Constitution in the future. That answers the question.
Yeah, very, very interesting. I think we'll touch a little bit more upon that later as far as the results go. But thank you, Dean, for your time. Your contributions are much valued. And we're going to move on to a man who needs no introduction, Mr. Declan Gilmartin. Declan over here is an expert on the events that transpired during the Battle of Yorktown. So we are blessed to receive such granular input from these specialists. So we're just going to pass on to Declan with our first question here. What role exactly would you say that trenches played in the battle?
Yeah, so the American, the French, their entire strategy was based upon these trenches. When they first get there, the first thing they do is they dig these trenches. I think, as Will touched upon earlier, you could correct me if I'm wrong, it was around 800 yards away from the first redoubts or whatever. And as time went on, Washington would slowly move these trenches up to, in fact, be able to reach these redoubts and reach Yorktown, so they would be able to fire. I think it was October 9th, this was the first shot of the war, and this is when the trenches were first fully capable of, reaching British soldiers, British troops, with cannons, with muskets. And then you move to October 14th, actually October 11th, and Washington moves these trenches up 400 yards closer. And then that leads to the events of October 14th, which, could be debated as the most important of the entire battle, in which the British were caught in a surprise attack by the American and the French troops, and they ended up seizing redoubts 9 and 10.
Very interesting. Now, obviously, trenches played a very significant role in the war, but many don't think that role that they play, that significant role, takes away from the significance of naval forces within this battle. So we'd like to touch upon some of the importance, some key factors in the navies of both the British and the Americans in this battle.
Yeah, so the American and the French, encircling, surrounding the British forces at Yorktown with these trenches, that was only half the battle. They were still on the York River, and what Cornwallis's plan was to stay there until British troops could, come and rescue them. They would just keep fending off these French troops until they were able to be rescued. But luckily for Washington, I believe it was Francois Count de Grasse. He had just finished up at the Battle of Chesapeake, which occurred early September. And he was in need of naval forces on the York River to, complete the circle of closing in the British forces. And really what they were thinking here was to halt the import of food, the import of more troops, artillery, all the essentials needed, and they would just wait them out. So, we think about a hypothetical without the Navy, the British would have been rescued, and maybe this war would have gone on longer. Who knows?
Very interesting. Thank you so much, Mr. Gilmartin, for your time. We really appreciate it. Now we're going to move on. Obviously, with this being the battle that supposedly turned the world upside down, we're going to have a lot to say about the effects of this battle and what came after. And who better to discuss these effects than our resident expert on the effects of Yorktown, Mr. Aidan Murphy. Welcome, Aidan Murphy.
Hi, yeah. Good to be here, Will.
Great to have you.
I would say that the two really main reasons that Battle of Yorktown was so influential and just so key in ending the war was, first, that the British force at Yorktown was roughly a full quarter of the British forces in America at the time. It was like just under 8,000 soldiers, so it was like 7,500 soldiers that were stationed there. And when they were all defeated, this also took out the entire British force in the south. So they had no fleet and no remaining forces in the south now. And this basically essentially took out their hold in the south and weakened their hold in the north. And the second key reason of why the Battle of Yorktown was so key in ending the war was that the British public's belief and the British Parliament's belief in the belief that Britain could still win the war was greatly shaken and pretty much defeated at this battle. And so at the next Parliament election, a pro-American Parliament was elected, and they immediately opened peaceful negotiations with Americans and the French.
Very interesting. Now, I'll ask you, what was the significance of the Treaty of Paris after this battle occurred?
So the Treaty of Paris is obviously the treaty that ended the war. It wasn't just an end to fighting and hostilities. It also established the U.S. as an independent and free nation. So Britain promised to release the colonies and to recognize the U.S. as a free and independent nation. Along with that, it officially designed the disputed U.S. borders, and Britain actually gave or released and sacrificed the Northwestern territories, which essentially doubled the U.S.'s land area at the time and set up the westward expansion movement once more for America. And finally, the Treaty of Paris greatly demonstrated the political prowess and ability of the U.S. negotiators and politicians, especially because two of their key members, Jefferson and Henry Lawrence, were not present at the time.
Very interesting. Now, speaking of that, Jefferson's absence during this during the signing of this treaty, Dean touched upon it a little bit as to what Jefferson was doing at this time, why he wasn't here during this pivotal point in American history. But as an expert on effects, I'm sure you have something to say on the long-term effects of Jefferson's absence here.
Of course. So a huge part of the immediate effects of Jefferson's lack of just being there was as adversary and in politics, Alexander Hamilton. As Dean already said, he played a major role in the battle. But meanwhile, Jefferson, who was currently in hiding and fled Virginia, he was given credit and given praise for leading Virginia out of this conflict. And Hamilton was infuriated that this governor of Virginia who had fled and wasn't even there was given the most credit out of even though all the men who actually participated in the battle, except Washington and the generals, weren't given any credit. And it's very important to note that Jefferson and Hamilton were on opposite sides of the political spectrum, where Jefferson was a Democratic Republican, and Hamilton was a Federalist. And this great divide and struggle between the two, and they were both very influential political members. This divide between them could very well be said that it's attributed to the divide of political parties even today.
Very interesting how those long-term effects tend to pan out. Unless anyone has any closing statements to make that I didn't ask about, that's going to wrap it up for this historical segment of CM News. So a big thank you to our panelists, and thank you to our viewers. You guys keep us going. So have a great evening, and we'll see you in the next installment.